Hey, it's Warren Huart here. Hope you're doing marvelously well. I'm sitting here with the wonderful Ariel Chobaz. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. So you're between studios, hence you're at mine.
Yes, and it's a gorgeous one at that. I've been admiring all the gear. It's crazy how much gear you have.
I know, it's got a little silly.
It's overwhelming, to be honest, because I mean, most of the studios I work out of don't have this impressive of an analog setup, honestly.
Which is quite funny for a guy like me that's working so much more increasingly in the box.
Right.
I've said this. I've said this before. This is a good first question. When I first started, this is what we all aspired to: was to have a console and tons of outboard, the Pultecs and the mics and the this and the that. If I started now, knowing what I know now, I would never build this up. What do you think?
Well, no, I think there's always going to be room for this, for the gear, because there's certain things, there's certain approaches to music that I don't think you can do just in the box. I feel like when you take it out, it's much easier to have a community approach. You know, you can have people come up and actually touch the faders.
I like that's a great analogy.
I think it helps the creative process, especially if you're with a band or a group, or even with just writers and producers. They can kind of put their 2 cents in, and even if you kind of undo it on your end on the computer, you know what I mean? At least they're involved, and I mean, sometimes it can be to the detriment of the record, but most of the time I feel like when you have people that are really heavily involved in creative process, be able to actually touch and move things around, it actually helps the record. So I think there's always going to be room for this.
Great, I like that.
Yeah, we're not all just going to be stuck in our one room with our one
Cubicles.
computer. You know, I mean, maybe one day and we'll just be like Skyping everything back and forth, but you know, there's always going to be space for this kind of creative atmosphere, really, because that's what it creates.
Oh, I agree with that, especially for more organic approaches.
Yes,
you know,
exactly.
I do a lot of records where I get to play instruments, like a lot of instruments, hence all the guitars and basses and piano and drums all over the place. And that's a blessing. I can get a solo artist in and I can really have some fun and pick up instruments and play. But increasingly, so here's an interesting question. So I just put up a video and I was interviewing this guy, Tim Randolph, and we said right at the beginning, it's a really exciting time to be doing music. And somebody immediately responded, but all the music sounds the same. Of course, I was like, yeah, pop music. Top 40 radio definitely has that, but otherwise it's massive, the amount of genres, and creativity that's going on. The
amount of mashups. I mean, right now, I've always felt like with the amount of accessibility, you're getting more of the same, but you're also getting more of the unique, and maybe you have to dig a little deeper, but there's so many more people making music and have access to it. It's just unavoidable that you're going to have more of everything.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You know, you go back even 30 years, it was so expensive and so hard to do that only a select few could do it, or the ones that broke through, and now you have, I mean, anyone can do it almost. So there's so much more. But yeah, if you're only listening to the top 40 or whatever, certain A&Rs, you know, are approving, or radio station, you know, they'll have their lists of music that they can play. And if you're listening to that one station, you know, like here, I forget what it is, maybe 97.1, but I would swear that it's like the same 10 songs on loop repeat. So I have to change the station, because like I'll get in the car, turn on, you know, the engine, and there's a song playing. I'll get out, like for, you know, this interview, I'll go back in, it's the same song playing. So you gotta just, you know, find your own music, I guess. If you're being spoon-fed everything, it will seem all the same, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a step, and radio still has a place, of course, but it's evaporating fast.
Yes.
I'm not saying it's going to ever disappear, but...
well, now you can create your own station, so you just, you know, go on Pandora or something like that, and you can probably find more eclectic stuff. And I always look to my brother, because he always finds and sends me weird off-the-wall stuff. And
is he younger?
He's younger, and then usually a few years later, it becomes mainstream, which is, but he's, yeah, anyways.
So maybe the A&R should employ him.
Exactly. Get younger guys.
Agreed. Okay, so tell me a little bit about your journey. Where are you from originally?
Originally, I'm from Gainesville, Florida, which is a tiny town where the Florida Gators are from if you watch college football or basketball. And really, it's just a college town. It's tiny, fairly uncultured, and I think maybe a couple bands have come out of there that have made it to the big time, but that's where I grew up. And when I was in high school, I was kind of ready to move on, and my mom wanted to come out here to pursue film, and so we moved out here, and I haven't really looked back since. And when I got out here, I finished high school, and then I ended up going to San Diego for a couple years of college, and kind of realized for audio engineering, they had programs for it, but it wasn't geared specifically for engineering, and so I ended up going to MI in Hollywood. Like, I moved back to LA to go to MI, and that's where I kind of started my, I guess it was the Journeyman Certificate Recording Program.
Oh, great. I went and spoke at MI a couple of years ago. I thought it was pretty together. You had a great time there?
I did. I mean, it was a lot of fun. It was fast-tracked. What I'd say, though, is, going to these schools, they have a lot of people coming in and out. I felt like MI was cool because they were really honest with me. We had classes of 10. And somewhere in the beginning, one of the teachers said, to be totally honest, only 1 out of every 10 of you will be working in the music field within 5 years.
Right.
And so I just was determined at that point to be the one person out of the entire class to still be working. And somehow I've done it. So grateful for that.
So from school, what happened next? What was your journey from there?
Basically, I mean, just so I can, help anyone that's on that path. I was recording, my own band in high school, and then in college, I was taking Pro Tools and recording classes. So when I went to MI, I think I aced the entrance exam that they had going to the recording program. So what they did is they put me in an internship program 3 months before anyone else.
Nice.
And I ended up interning at Enterprise Studios, which was, at the time, I think it was like the second busiest studio in the US. I think second only to the Hit Factory in New York or something. So being there, that was where the real schooling began. MI was great for getting me that internship, but once I got to the studio, that's where I learned, everything that I actually use. At MI, it was the basics, is the foundation, I guess, that maybe you take for granted after a while. But until you're in the studio, really turning knobs and feeling the pressure and trying to match what other people are doing, being inspired and being surrounded by incredible artists and engineers, that was the real schooling. I'm not encouraging you to skip school, but if you can get an internship at a good, busy recording studio, that's going to be that was my fast track to. What did you do? Did you have to come in and did you run first before you got to assist? Okay, yeah.
Good.
Yeah, so I was interning, and when I was interning, I was mostly helping out the techs, just simple little things, unscrewing the consoles, stuff like that. And then I started running, which was just getting food orders, and it was one of those things where you'd go, I mean, this was basically break down my night. I'd go, to a restaurant or something, pick up food for one of the artists. I'd come back, and then someone would see it, and then they'd want the same thing. So I go back to the same place, come back, and I'd be like, okay, does anybody else want anything? And then someone else would want the same thing. So it was literally, my night was going back and forth to the same location because someone would smell it and then want it. So it was ridiculous. But yeah, that was about it. And then in the off hours, I would practice throwing songs up or recording my own stuff and trying to get my chops up that way. And fortunately, Enterprise Studios was pretty cool about that because we had a couple techs that were basically like, go crazy. If you break something, let us know. And so it was a pretty incredible place to be. Maybe part of the reason it's not around anymore, I don't know, because it did.
I don't know about that. I think it's interesting. I was just talking to the studio manager for NRG, and she was saying that their policy is the same thing. They encourage the runners and the assistant engineers to record their bands. I used to do it when I had a commercial facility, and the problem is that not many people take them up.
That's true. Yeah, that is true. I mean, which I didn't understand. You know, when I started my internship, the first thing I did was ask the studio manager, what is the fastest way I can move forward from running to assisting? And he said, work the night shift.
Learn the rooms.
So what did I do? I worked 8 p.m. to 8 a.m.,
Yeah.
6 days, sometimes 7 days a week. And in that time, I was able, you know, from like 4 to 6 in the morning, there's always going to be some down times in one of the rooms. I was able to get in and just bust my ass to learn the stuff. And I learned it well enough that, you know, eventually they noticed that. So I kept telling them, you know, if anything comes up, if someone flakes, if someone gets sick, you know, I know this console, and I was able to prove it. And one time there was a session, I think, for Scott Storch that came up, and something happened with the assistant, and they called me up to do it. And fortunately, I did know the console because I'd been spending every night working with it. And yeah, I didn't drop the ball, so I got more assistant gigs, and then I became a full-time assistant.
That's great.
So
that's really good. That sparks off so many things. There's a famous Conrad Hilton quote where he talks about if you're the bellhop or something like that, and you say to you're being asked by one of the hotel guests, oh, by the way, my plumbing's not working in the bathroom. It is your job to follow up and make sure that happens. And the reason why I like that analogy and that story is because when I'm in a studio, especially a studio I've never been in before, everybody that works there is the same to me.
Right.
So you could be the assistant or you could be the runner. If I come up and go, hey, the DBX has gone out on the left-hand channel, the blah, 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 I just see you the same way as I see the assistant engineers, I see the manager, I see whatever. You're a representative of the studio.
Correct.
So just because you're running doesn't mean you're any less important. To a client,
no,
you're at the same level. And I think that's a really important thing that doesn't get talked about. Is like you're in this potential opportunity because many, many times I've asked an assistant who is a runner, and the thing got sorted out. And I like to always give praise where praise is due. So I leave and I'll be like, hey, I had a great time, worked really well. Oh, that guy, John, he was great. He figured out that thing for me. Yeah, and then so that guy, John's career just took a notch up because...
Initiative.
So it's a weird one. I think that I talk about a lot Tommy Vicari, who worked in Capitol Building in the mailroom, and then at night went down and helped out in the studios for free. Right. Because he couldn't get a job in the studios in the 60s, because Capitol Records in the 60s, Capitol Studios, I mean, there was 1,000 people applying for every one job. Yeah. They had the Beatles and the Beach Boys and Frank Sinatra. It was like they owned American music.
Incredible building.
Yeah, and it's an incredible building.
It's like iconic now.
And so he worked for free for a few years until somebody said, oh, you should assist this session. So.
I'd say initiative and also attitude, because once I started assisting, you know, I was assisting for random sessions and random engineers. And at the time, Dave Pensado was working at Enterprise, and I think his assistant went on vacation for a couple weeks or something, so he needed a fill-in. Anyways, he went through a few people, and then I got a chance to fill in for a day. And even though, you know, I'd only been assisting a really short time, I really wasn't nearly as experienced as every other person in the building and every other person he had in the room. You know, he said my attitude, you know, because I wanted to learn, and I made it clear that if I didn't know something, I would figure it out, or I'd ask someone who did. And it was like, you know, that hunger was there to learn more. I think he saw that and picked up on it. And so even though I didn't have the experience, I really did have a can-do attitude and wanted to learn. I genuinely wanted to learn.
And the attitude in general beyond that of like, when you're asking something of somebody and they don't make you feel like it's an imposition.
Right, exactly.
Hey, could you plug in the thing? I need to, left-hand side's feeling a little weird. Can you check that out for me? Is it crackling? Oh, is it? It's not going to work. Right. It's not going to work as well as, sure, no problem.
Yeah. Exactly. And sometimes if you don't know stuff, admitting to it, but having the wherewithal to actually do the research or find someone that does, and then really learn it. So next time it comes up, you do know it. Yeah, like to me that was so exciting. Like I would love, you know, when there was something I didn't know, because that just meant, okay, I'm gonna now know something that I didn't know before. It obviously came up once, it'll probably come up again. And there was a tough learning curve in the beginning, especially going from, you know, just assisting a few random sessions to working for Dave Pensado. I think I screwed up a few recalls in the beginning. Basic, you know, simple mistakes, you know, like your patch bay here.
It's a nightmare.
Yeah, if your patch bay doesn't look like a bird's nest, then you're probably not working, right?
Yeah, that's a bird's nest and a half.
Right, so you're busy and you're working, and so to try to do a recall, I mean, anyways, I think I maybe had one patch off by one, and they just threw the whole mix off.
Well, the one I've had is where the TT isn't quite in, and it actually makes the signal out of phase, like on a reverb coming back. And I'm listening to a vocal going, this just feels weird. What is going on?
Right.
And then we go to the reverb and push it in, and boom, the reverb's in phase. But it just threw out the whole mix slightly, and you couldn't figure out what it was.
And it's just one patch.
Just one not quite inserted properly. Can just make the whole mix feel weird.
Oh yeah, I was so defeated after having a couple bad recalls that I made sure I memorized the patch bay, memorized every piece of gear to know exactly where it was and where it was on the patch bay, and I feel like every patch bay also has its inconsistencies. So you gotta you gotta just spend time learning it just to know, you know, some things aren't even gonna be labeled correctly all the time.
Sure.
So I highly suggest you know the patch bay in the studio you're working out of.
Absolutely. One of the things, what about this one? One of the things I try to say to assistants, especially when I'm in a new studio, I don't care about quick. Right is so much better than quick.
Right.
And I think sometimes, and this is a thankless thing for an assistant, sometimes you don't get noticed until you do something wrong.
Right.
It sucks.
And I would say it's the opposite. You know, you more want to be a fly on the wall when you're kind of coming up, when you're more inexperienced. Not that you can't have a personality, but you really want to stay out of the way, you know, and let the creative people do what they do. Because as an assistant, you're the support crew, and so if you're overly talkative, or you just try to make your presence known, that will usually be seen as a bad thing. So I always try to be a fly on the wall, kind of unnoticed, like the second you need something, I'm there. And just make sure it runs smoothly, but yeah. We
had a guy on his first day, Eric's gonna laugh, sitting on the couch there, on his first day, give advice on a mix to the artist.
Right.
On his first day.
That's pretty ballsy.
And in front of the artist, I basically gave him you ever do that again, I'm gonna fire you, in front of the artist. I didn't even have the time to take him outside. I was just like, because we're doing a mix recall. Yeah. He's like, oh, what I think you should do is I'm like, are you for real?
No,
like derailing a whole mix because he has an opinion.
There's so many egos in a room already. I mean, I think to be an engineer, you have to have a kind of a big ego.
Well, the thing is, you got an artist, and suddenly the artist is like, what? There's something wrong with my mix?
Right.
It's like, really? Are you gonna derail?
No. I mean, if people ask for your opinion, definitely. And you want to have a smart response, so it's always good to be thinking about the mix and thinking about what you're hearing. Well, I was new
from the lowest thing. I was never an assistant. I was an assistant in my studio.
Right.
So I've always had studios, so I would assist other people. And when they came in, all I knew was the pecking order.
Right.
So my opinion was the same as the engineers was the same as the producer. Simple as that. So I was always agreeing with the producer, but I was never bypassing the engineer. The engineer is
smart.
Yeah, exactly. So
there's a hierarchy.
There's a hierarchy. So if they said, "What do you think?" If I heard you as the engineer say, "I think it should be louder or quieter," whatever you said, because you knew you were agreeing with the producer, I was just like agreeing with you.
Right.
Essentially agreeing with the producer, but I made sure that I understood that my role was beneath you.
Yeah.
Because one of the most frustrating things is when you're engineering, I'd like to hear any stories you have on this, is when the assistant is trying to ingratiate himself with the famous producer or the famous artist or something like that. It's like, dude.
Yeah, no, that usually gets cut pretty fast. And I mean, I feel like this is good advice no matter how big or small the session is, you know. If, you know, it gets amplified when you're working with big superstar names, but even if you know you're running your own, you know, smaller operation, you have to pay attention to the pecking order or the hierarchy of things, because you're juggling egos, and at the top is the artist, and then it goes down from there, and you got to make sure you don't leapfrog, like you're saying. Don't kind of go around to make yourself look better than the engineer or whatever, because that's how you kind of move forward. I mean, you have to be on everyone's good side. The music industry is so small, and you know, once you're in it, you kind of realize how small it is. But you know, maybe when you're still trying to get in the game, it feels like this big unknown thing. But the music community, you know, I want to say it's like everyone's just one person removed. You know what I mean? Take me and you, for example. You know, we had never really talked or worked together, but you've worked with quite a few of my friends. You know, randomly. I had no idea.
And all of your manager, whole client list, basically, except for you.
Right, so, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, the engineering and I mean, the music community, I shouldn't say engineering, but the music community is much smaller than one might think if you're not working in it. So just bear that in mind. Always be good to the person above you, the person that's bringing you in, pulling you in, or whoever you're working for.
I want good people. I'm not looking to alienate. I love having good people around me.
Exactly.
It's so much more enjoyable when you can just trust the other person's got your back and you've got theirs, and you're all just in it to win it together. It's just so much more fun than trying to sit in a studio where somebody is trying to one-up each other. And I have to, as a producer, and I don't know if you've come across this often with bands, try and keep them in check when the singer's trying to get closer to me, which alienates the rhythm section. I have to make sure that the rhythm section feels important too.
Right. That's the hardest part. I mean, when it comes to mixing, you know, I always try to find out who's approving the mix, you know, and depending on what instrument they play or whatever, you kind of make that the loudest thing. You know what I mean? But yeah, that is a tough part, juggling those egos. But you also mentioned too about having each other's back. I think that was probably the biggest thing for me also when I started assisting was you know, having that eagerness to learn, but also really having that sense of loyalty, you know, to Dave Pensado, who I started assisting for. So he knew he could trust me to have his back when it came to anything, whether it was the mix, the files. If he messed up, you know, I would take the fall for it. If something happened or you know, whatever story's going down, I would back it up, even if, you know, I didn't really know what he was talking about. You know what I mean? But it does, you have to have each other's back, and so know where you are in that.
I remember doing a mix record with Dave Sardy when I was working with him, and there was one of the guitars that had accidentally been muted in the bridge, and he was probably going through and checking stuff and muted it, and we got a mixed comment back about it, and I remember being like, oh yeah, that was me, I accidentally muted it, and he may not even noticed if he had done it or I had done it, but
yeah.
The point is you look after people.
Yes.
And it's like,
and people remember that.
People remember that, and you keep working with them. And it's like, especially with artists, because they have very fragile egos.
Right.
Because in their defense, we're here. We're on this side of the glass. Life is great. We get to work with, if we have long, illustrious 40, 50-year careers, we're going to work with thousands of different people.
Yeah, that are going to come and go.
Yeah. And an artist, unless they're going to change from a singer to a rapper, really only has one career in their vocals.
Right, yeah, that's true.
So we have to be mindful of that. It's not like they're going to suddenly go, oh, I'm reinventing myself tomorrow. Now I'm a rapper. Now I'm an R&B. I mean, yeah, you can do it to a certain extent, but you don't get the opportunity we do to prove ourselves in so many genres. And
well, and I think the artists have probably the most fragile egos. You know, they go out, you know, seeking the approval of thousands or tens of thousands, if not millions of people, right? They're seeking that approval, and it becomes this cycle where, you know, that's all they live and breathe is seeking that approval. So their egos become really fragile. There's some artists at the top that become really secure, but very few, very few.
My first big break was not a big break as such. It was the first opportunity I got to work with real people. Right. I recorded Louise Goffin in the late 80s, and I was just a kid in my studio, or a studio I was working at. It was more of a home studio environment. Andy Jackson came in, who was Pink Floyd's producer and engineer. So I'm like like this. I'm like, Louise Goffin's the artist. Girl Ann Dorsey from Bowie's band, she wasn't in Bowie's band at the time. She was the bass player.
That's incredible.
And I'm just like, you know, we've got this 1-inch 24 track machine and I'm on a soundtracks 36. Good. And Andy Jackson walks in and I'm like, he recorded drums with like 4 mics and it sounded amazing. The drummer was obviously amazing. I didn't touch a single piece of equipment when he left. I didn't know how it sounded better. All I know is it sounded a lot better than I could do. So I left the compressor the same way. It was our drum kit, luckily, so there was still the mics in the same place. I had the compression. Obviously, the next guy came in and played with different dynamics, but on the whole, it sounded good because I just copied it. And I remember for years, that was awesome. Kind of how I used to do things, because I didn't hear the subtle differences in compression.
Right.
I didn't hear the subtle differences between attack and releases and stuff like that. So sometimes I get critical of people only concentrating on the technical, because I think that is unfortunate. That's why there's 1,000 YouTube channels talking about how to mix a kick drum, you know, because there's more about the why is more important than the how. Why did you do this?
Right.
Not
but
like
at
how.
the end of the day, I mean, it comes down to the ear training, you know what I mean? And really spending the time to learn how each compressor works. But I feel like in the beginning, we're so caught up in the bigger picture that it does take a while. Because I feel like even for myself, I mean, I feel like I'm still learning compression. I feel a lot more comfortable with it now, but the first, 5 years of my career, I feel like I was kind of just hit or miss, like, like kind of experimenting, hoping it'll work, and then having, other producers and engineers, tweak those settings and then learning from it and seeing what sounded better. It was a long process. I mean, it's still a process, really.
But what's interesting when you're mixing on SSL is, compression is a different world with SSLs, because the sound of an SSL for me is the sound of the EQ being boosted, slamming into a compressor.
Right.
Which is not really something I think about when I'm mixing in the box.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Which is probably why I tend to use like the SSL collection, a lot in my mixes, because it kind of has everything you need, right? So you can just quickly roll off some low end, get a good EQ going, and then hit that compressor, and
it gives you that spank.
It gives you that spank, and I was fortunate enough to get to see a few big time mixers mix when I was working at Enterprise, and one thing I noticed when they were working on the SSL, like doing big rock stuff, like Andy Wallace, who did like Nirvana and big bands, the amount of compression you can get away with on the SSL is incredible, and he would just slam just about every channel, and God, he would get such a great sound. And I tried to do the same thing in the box, and I couldn't get it to work. But I feel like the SSL compression, you can really smack it and really, I mean, get a good sound. It's hard to go wrong with an SSL compressor.
I also like the mix bus in general. The actual, says the man with no phase meter there. Right. But basically, Bruce, can I get it back? It's fine. Basically, my mix starts like this and ends like that. It's like there's something about my bus that if I'm slamming it, it's like natural limiting. Yeah, it really does, and it doesn't give me that perceived distortion that I could never do that in a digital world. Yeah,
I always like to tell myself there's more room for error on an SSL.
A lot more.
Because you can just keep boosting, and the more you saturate it, like the more you hit that master bus, it just starts to sound really good. I think, that's maybe the one thing I spent a lot of time wrapping my head around was how to push a mix in the box and get it to sound as good as a mix on the console.
Well, that's a good question. What is your general sort of master fader? Is a thing? Did you have go-tos to go on your master?
Yeah, and I kind of show it in the tutorial. I mean, it's just I'll do a limiter, a multi-band compression, and then another limiter. Oftentimes, I'll put an EQ at the front of all that. But sometimes, I mean, it's kind of different every time. You kind of just do what you do, and then you pick it apart later, and you're like, why the heck did I do all this? You know what I mean? Yeah. But sometimes I'll have like 4 L2s in a row, each one doing like -2 dB threshold, instead of like having one with -8. For whatever reason, I did it that way. But But for me, the way to match it is you just have to have, you know, good references. So whatever I know sounds really good and really hot and has all the punch and the loudness that I want, I just A/B that with my Pro Tools mix. And I think it does take a lot of ear training to be able to figure that out, because you can't just slam everything and then slam the master bus. Because if you go and A/B it, you'll notice, you know, whatever you're A/Bing that you think sounds incredible will have so much more low end and is still somehow louder. You know what I mean? So yeah, I guess it just comes down to ear training. I don't think there's one specific thing I do, but I definitely try to control the dynamics as much as I can in the individual tracks to make it easier to mix into the stereo bus.
Yep.
And then the other thing I'd say I do is probably halfway through my mix, I'll actually start putting on the master bus plugins.
Yep.
Let's say I have like the drums and the music kind of roughed in, you know, then I'll start throwing in some limiting stuff, and then I'll start comparing it and just see where I'm at. And then once I start mixing the vocals, I'll take that off again, because you'll start making bad decisions if you have, you know, your limiter slammed. You'll be hearing things different than it is. So you kind of got to check it, take it off,
right,
continue mixing, and then I'll throw it back on. And then I'd say like the last couple hours of my mix, I definitely have the mastering stuff. Even if it's going to go to a professional mastering engineer, you know, I want to make sure it's approved, and they're listening back to it with it as hot as possible and as hot as it would be coming off of an SSL.
Right. Do you find that that's what's going to the mastering engineer though, or do you pull some of that stuff off afterwards?
I pull everything off other than EQ and anything that's adding texture. So I try to look at it like production plugins versus mastering plugins. So like if I put, you know, a tape emulation, you know, on the master, I'll definitely leave that. If it's an EQ, I'll leave that, because to me that's kind of creative.
I actually have this is very snobby, I have a pair of Pultecs on my master bus at all times.
Oh, awesome.
So I'm doing a little 60 and a little 12.
All right, so some of the air, a little low end bump.
Yeah, and it's not much. I mean, it's like 2.5. And they're the mastering ones, so they're clickable and recallable. So if I do change it, I can go back. They're not like
right, smooth.
I can't remember the experts out there, which I'm not. I don't believe it's a dB boost until you get to like a 3. I can't remember. 10 is definitely not 10 dB. It's like maybe 6 at the most.
Right.
But anyway, so it's just a little bit of that, you know. Most of the guys I admire always have like a Pultec across the bus.
Yeah, Pultec or NTI or I mean, when I'm working
George
in the box,
Massenburg, the GMLs.
right, the GMLs are incredible too.
Yeah.
But I'd say a lot of people, adding air behind it. I tend to do corrective EQing too. Like if, you know, I get too far into a mix, or not, you know, I get far into a mix and I notice there's too much 3K building up or too much mid-range, I'll usually pull, you know, a little bit out on the master bus rather than kind of going back and retweaking, unless it's obvious, like it's all the vocal. But sometimes you just have instruments in the same frequency range and you don't realize they're kind of, you know, adding up on the master bus. I'll do corrective stuff there too.
Right. Excellent.
Shortcut.
Now, when you were talking about the SSL, is that waves or UAD? Do you have a preference?
I would say the UAD ones they have more options and it's probably better. I tend to use the SSL.
SSL's own ones.
I mean, I'm sorry, the Waves SSL
Right.
ones. They have such low latency and they just use so little CPU. I can almost load up a ton of them.
Right.
But the other ones, I don't have that many UAD. I have 2 UAD chips. So
Sure.
anyways, I can't get away with that much. But I know you can do certain things like on UAD one, like boosting the line and switching it over to mic. Like they don't even have that option on the Waves.
Right.
So there's certain things you can only do, but you know, I tend to just use the Waves one.
I think my SSL's always in line, so. I like it when the red light comes on certain instruments and other ones I don't.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's like red, red, and other times it's red, 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 red.
Little overload. That's fine.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of like on a snare, it kind of goes, it kind of gets all mushy, which sometimes is amazing and other times is awful.
Right.
You know, it's like you choose when to do it. Like bass guitars, the problem when it does it on the bass guitar, it seems like the low end starts to go first.
Right.
So I tend not to. You won't see as many red lights going on a bass guitar as it would be on, say, a snare. The kick, a nanosecond's fine.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, you can touch it. It's fine.
But it's interesting. Everybody I've ever mixed with, Andy, Chris, CLA, everybody that's ever mixed on an SSL, there's a lot of red lights going.
Oh, yeah. And that was also, you know, I keep mentioning Dave Pensado because he was, you know, the guy I first started really assisting for, and at the time we were doing, you know, just single after single. We did hundreds of massive singles. But one of the first things he had me do, and it's kind of hard to do in the box, but he had me tape up all the meters on everything, and we did a mix, and then had me pull it off, and it was like everything was technically wrong. Like everything was slamming in the red, like technically no-nos, like that's why they put it there, right? Like, okay, you should trim it back. But he was like, at the end of the day, it all comes down to what you're hearing. And I do feel like there's a disconnect with that when I'm mixing in the box, and I have to kind of almost coach myself, because you're looking at numbers, and because, you know, when you do hit digital zero, like digital distortion isn't pleasant, so you kind of tend to play it safer. But I have to remind myself, it really comes down to what you're hearing. So I'll tend to boost, I think, cut by like 15 dB if necessary.
It's a very interesting point. There's a little bit of a disconnect depending on where you started your career. If somebody started their career maybe post 2000, whatever, they ask me different questions to people that started before that. Right. People that started, you know, even mid-late 90s, don't ask me what they should print at. They're like, should it be minus 18, minus DFUSCQ1, minus 14, plus, plus? And I'm like, I don't know. And they're all like, what do you mean you don't know? I'm like, because we grew up just making records, and it was always print hard, drive things hard, make it sound good, you know, blah. It was always this sort of like, get it exciting, and so because we could only listen. When we first started, you could only listen. You couldn't look.
You're forced to kind of just use your ears.
And I understand the question, and there's no disrespect to people asking that question, because like you're saying, we have issues with digital distortion.
Well, and there's like, you know, if they're from the post world, there's actual broadcast limits, and you can get fined huge amounts of money if you go over these, like, you know.
I did X Factor for 2 years, and they sent out this form, and it told us what we had to do to print it. And I printed it exactly the way they wanted it to, and limited it to that. And I got to the show, and I gave it to them. And the front of house guys and all the live guys and everybody working goes, why are your mixes so quiet? I'm like, I printed them at the level you told me. He goes, oh, they send it out every year. Nobody pays any attention to that. So it was like, it was like Matt Squire, John Shanks, and Howard Benson, me, and Julian Bonetta. And it was great. But they were all just printing it, and Julian had done, I think he did 3 seasons. I only did the second 2 and 3. He did 1, 2, and 3. And they were just making it like records. Yeah. But I was trying to do this thing, and I kept getting...
Yeah, I would ignore all of that, because that, you know, if there are going to be any broadcast limitations, that's up to the companies that are actually putting it out. So you want to make yours as hot as possible, deliver that, and then whoever's on the other end will make sure that they put it at the right level. Yeah. Because that's probably one of the worst things, is when you're doing a live show or a live performance or something, and then you hear it back and it's like not as loud as the act before, the act after, or on the radio or whatever. You really wanted to compete and
oh, the front of house guy had me come up, and he's like, I've got my line amps cranked, and you're not getting, I can't put you through the PA loud enough. And I'm like, well, I did the minus 18, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, no. Yeah. He's like, everybody just sends it slammed. He goes, just send it slammed.
Right. On the other end, they'll end up training. And I mean, the guys that are saying that stuff around, they have no idea, because they just think audio is audio. But no, that's strictly once it like gets to like the truck, and then they're sending it out to the satellites. Yeah. They have their own technicians that bother with that. So. Right. Good rule of thumb, make it hot without losing the quality of the record. As hot as you can.
What's interesting about what we're doing here, what we're doing is talking about this stuff, is like you're a new dad.
Right.
And I've got 2 kids, and one younger, one a little bit older. And the best piece of advice I've ever heard, I probably told you it as a joke, but it's true, that I ever heard was from my friend, one of my friends who has 5 kids in England. And he told me this piece of advice when my son was born. I was like, oh, what do I do? And he goes, let me tell you the most important piece of advice about parenting. And I'm like, what is it, oh guru? And he goes, ignore everybody's advice. Because everybody has done something, and then, you know, you have to find your own way. And I sometimes feel like, and you know probably where I'm going, with what we do, my overall thing is like what we're talking about by coming up in analog as versus digital. It was forced us to listen.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't as many absolutes because there couldn't be.
Right.
It was still kind of mysterious. Mm-hmm. I remember mixing with a famous mixer who will remain nameless, and he covered the console when we did the playback, so you couldn't see his EQ or compression settings.
That's strange.
Yeah, it was very strange. But it was some kind of magic thing. The point is it's like, it used to be kind of voodoo because you couldn't see it.
Right.
You couldn't say it's behind. You had to listen and go, it's behind.
Uh-huh.
Now we look at it and go, the beat's behind.
Right.
Or it's not in tune. What do you mean? It sounds in tune to me. No, look, if you read it, it doesn't go in a straight. It's. I think you understand what I'm saying. I almost feel like
that's a great point. Yeah.
It's almost like take all of this in, but bear in mind is how does it sound?
Well, and I think for me, one of the most, this is going to sound terrible, but one of the heartbreaking moments for me, or just, you know, crushing moments was I really thought, you know, if I can get in with one of these top guys, I'll learn the voodoo secrets, right?
Right.
And then I'll be able to apply it to everything I do.
Yeah.
And you know, after going in and watching these great mixers, you know, I started noticing, you know, they had their go-to, you know, either gear or certain settings, but it wasn't a setting that they could slap across every song. It was just a setting that was good for this particular song and this key and this tempo for whatever reason, but their ears are so well trained that they know precisely where to go. So it almost seemed like voodoo magic, like, oh, they're just using one setting for this, one setting. As long as I learn that setting, I can apply it to everything, and that's exactly not how it works. And I think that was the toughest thing for me to wrap my head around, that there's no way to get around the years of ear training. Even if you're just pulling up already mixed records and then sweeping through the frequency bands or having someone else do it for you on a thin cue, and you trying to tell them what frequency they're boosting, or trying different, you know, compression techniques and seeing how it affects the record, and there's just no way around it. Mm-hmm. And for me, you know, getting to assist some of these big mixers, I was kind of forced into that position because we do recalls on the SSL, and as you know, the SSL, you can, you know, run through the recall a couple times, you know, but usually every time everything's going to be slightly off. Maybe you do it 3 times, finally goes through the whole board, but it still might not be perfect, and so I'd actually have to spend the time A-Bing to what we had printed to what was coming up on the board, and a lot of times, you know, something would be off, and I'd have to actually be able to notice, you know, that let's say the PCM 90,
right,
somehow that never changes, right? So I didn't mark it in my recall sheet.
Yeah.
Someone changed the decay time on the reverb, so I have to actually be able to hear and say, okay, that's, you know, 1.6 seconds, and now it's at 2.2, and so to be able to hear that difference on a snare, like it's only on one instrument, but I would just spend time like A-Bing to hear the most subtle differences, and eventually my ears started training, but yeah, there's not one like voodoo trick, you know what I mean?
No, but I love you talking about like the decay times and stuff, because I remember one of the first really good gigs I got was like working with Sardy, outside of being a producer and engineer on my own. But when I started like gathering like real credits, I remember I was editing stuff, and he had me sitting in this room, and he'd come in with all these notes and go, I need to, you know, this is all the takes I like this bar here, that bar there, you know, it was like really detailed stuff, and I'd be sifting through all these different takes, pulling together this stuff, because he would track the whole band live.
Right.
And so sometimes I'd be going to like 13 takes and piecing it together. and a master take and then listening. And it was very involved. And he'd be like, nah, I don't like that. Try this. One of the things I learned very early on is
impressive.
Yeah. And it was all on tape, and it was all done with that click tape that was transferred to Pro Tools and with no clicks.
It was like, anyways, that's
you want to learn anything, it's a baptism of fire. But one of the things I learned very quickly was like sometimes we hear on top and behind decay times and stuff like that, because one instrument affects the way you hear another.
Right.
So like the guy would be like, oh, the guitar's on top. It's like, no, actually it's not on top. But the beat it's playing is behind, so it makes it feel like it's on top. Move that beat, oh, suddenly everything feels good.
Right.
It's that sort of skill level of going, just because something's flamming doesn't mean the instrument you hear first is early.
Right.
It might be the instrument you hear afterwards is late.
But to expand on your point, a lot of times you kind of got to be able to hear through, what people are saying. So I'm just trying to think of an example, like with Nicki Minaj. Oftentimes she would complain that her vocal was too bright, but it never would end up being the vocal. It'd always be like the hi-hat. I'd end up, because I didn't want to dull her vocal, and I liked it where it was. So she'd be like, oh, my vocal's too bright. Can you warm it up a bit? And I'd go to the hi-hat or whatever was kind of bright and harsh. I would re-EQ that. That would warm the record up, and all of a sudden her vocal sounded perfect. Yeah. So it is that thing. It's knowing how it all comes together. And
one person's warm is not another person's warm.
That's true too.
A lot of people say to me they want it to feel warmer, and when they play me a reference, it's atmospheric and airy.
Right.
So to them, see, warm to an engineer means lows, low mids.
Right.
I like to say warm less and more weight. I like the weight, because that's what Transformers gave us, like weight. And so you think that, but then from an artist's perspective who has never learned anything about the technical side, I get it. When they mean warm, they just mean like they put on their headphones and they want to hear the vocal kind of wrap around. And what they're hearing is like delays and reverbs. Right. They play me a reference, and that to them, I've had it a couple of times, is their idea of warm. So, which is not what you and I think of warm is.
Right.
But once you understand what they're saying, you're like, oh, I get it. You want the Enya, airy, tons of delays and reverbs, so it wraps around you.
Yes.
It's like a warm feeling. It's a feeling, not a technical term.
Yes. And I mean, I've done so many unattended sessions the past couple of years that I've just made it a habit to, at the beginning of the mix, I'll actually, I'll ask them, or usually I'll beg them.
For references?
For, something that has the general sound or something that's out or released, whether it's a song I've mixed or someone else's mixed that has this sound that they're going for, because so much gets lost in the communication. Like you're saying, they might be like, I want it to sound more purple. Like, what the hell does that mean? You know what I mean? So I just...
Paisley Park.
Right. So I'm like, I try to get references from them, and often then too, you'll turn in a mix and they'll think, they'll give you notes, and you kind of have to like steer them back because they don't really know what they're talking about. So you'll be like, hey, A-B this record to the record you said sounds amazing, and you'll see them B, and they'll A-B it, and it's like, wow, okay. That does sound the way I want it to sound, but something else is not vibing right.
It's tough
changing the way they hear it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very tough for singers because they don't hear their voices like we do.
Right.
I've read many times about, Elvis Costello doesn't like the H, the huh, but that's his voice. You take that out. We love that about his voice, and maybe now he's accepted it, but that there's a lot of singers like that. One of the biggest thing I found, I was working with this young artist who was really, really talented, and he kept telling me that his vocal was too bright and that the S's were too aggressive. So I'd sit there and I was like drawing out everything, and I had DS's running, but I was sitting there and like drawing everything out.
Manually pulling down each one.
And it took hours, and it was an EP, so it's 5 songs and doing so much detail work, and sent it to him, and he's like, no, it still doesn't sound like I want it to. And I was like, okay, send me a reference. And the references he sent me were all like,
right.
Like the most, everything was so bright and almost too aggressive.
Right.
And his sounded dull. To just sound like this to me. And then I had to get him in, and I had to play him to him and go, one was, the other one's, oh, and I'm like, what do you mean?
Right. And I think that comes down to also how many times they're listening to the record. You get, sensitive to certain things. So you know,
Right.
a good rule of thumb, because I even do this to myself sometimes. Like you're listening on good speakers, and all of a sudden you start noticing the S's, and it does seem sharp. But I've learned, you know, I've kind of taught myself to lean towards being overly S, like too sharp, because that's what's going to cut through on radio.
Sure.
And especially at lower volumes, because you know, you might be cranking in here, but most of the time you're going to hear the song at, you know, a reasonable level. And so to have, you know, that stuff cut through, it sounds clearer. Sure. You can understand what they're saying better. So a lot of times, yes, exactly what you're saying, where you have to play them the reference, like, just so you know, the song that you say sounds incredible is much brighter than what we're doing here.
Yeah.
So
it's tough for singers. I liked like earlier Muse, when Rich Costey did, I can't remember what album or albums it was, but I remember when it came out was early-ish 2000s, and I remember referencing it, and it was so, I hate saying so compressed, because compressed doesn't mean anything. You can compress things and it's not audible.
Right.
But what it did is it inherently brought out these breaths, and everything was, and it was amazing, because it made the vocal so exciting.
Right. It's like in your face right like there.
This. But with especially early on in this guy's career, where he has such a pure voice, it gave it a bit more edge. It made him sound a little bit more aggressive, because everything was, and it was genius.
Yeah, I hate to say, but even nowadays, you know, I'll hear something and I'll think it sounds incredible, and then when I actually like go and play it back in the studio, it's like so much more compression than I would have done.
Yeah.
But it stands out, and especially, I don't know if it's something about radio compression too, but yeah, it's crazy. You definitely want to err on the side of too bright when it comes to vocals versus not bright enough.
Yeah, definitely. That took me a long time to learn. And I do all kinds of crazy crap on vocals. I do octaves and distortions and whisper tracks, and I just sit there and blend them and decide what sounds good. I don't use them all the time, all up. Sometimes I only pick and choose, but I do all kinds of insanity, because, you know, some guys and girls have very pure voices. So having a whisper or a distortion track gives them a little bit more rather than like this beautiful kind of, there's no substitute for acquired knowledge, like having lots of different palettes. Okay, so where did you move from then? Let's get back onto this journey. So you're assisting with Dave. What was the first thing you kind of mixed?
Well, after assisting Dave for a couple of years, I was kind of ready to do my own thing. I'd started doing mixes for him, not for him, but, you know, I would mix it, and then he'd come in and tweak from where I'd left off.
Right.
And that helped me to kind of build up my confidence, especially when, you know, towards, you know, when he'd only have a few changes. And granted, those few changes were, like, to me, mind-blowing, especially at the time, because I think I had the mix sounding just incredible. And he'd walk in and be like, oh, that's pretty good, but what do you think about this? And he'd tweak the few little things that would just take the mix over the top. But I had the chance to do that and have him kind of review my mixes, and so I ended up going on my own. And I think the first couple records I mixed were gospel records, actually. I did, Mary Mary and Trinity 5/7, and you know, maybe because it's more of a you know, smaller category or whatever, I think both of them got nominated for Grammys.
Fantastic.
So that kind of got some attention, and it helped again build my confidence. I was extremely lucky too. You know, Dave, you know, he really looks out for his assistants. You know, it's that loyalty. You know, I had his back for so many years that he really had my back too. And so he kind of told his manager what I was doing. And so I was fortunate enough to get managed by the same manager that Dave Pensado had at the time. Also, Dave started the Pensado Mix Squad, which was actually me and a couple other past assistants that he had, Dylan Dresdow and Jason Joshua. And so we did a few records like that where Dave was kind of the mix supervisor, because at the time he was doing so much work. And that was one of the crazier, most beneficial experiences for me, because...
And you actually got the credit?
Yeah, I got the credit.
Because a lot of mixers we know do that, but they don't credit the guys that are doing it.
No, we actually did get the credit.
Not saying any names, but
right. Yeah, no, I mean Dave.
That's good.
Really,
good for Dave. Yeah.
He's so loyal to his assistants because I mean, you end up being like family, right? We spend so much time in the studio. It's like being in the trenches. I mean, I don't want to compare ourselves to being in war necessarily because.
Sure.
So anyways, we were like family, so we definitely got the credit, but we got to do something that a lot of people don't do where, there was a few of us mixing one record, and because Dave was the mix supervisor, we all had to go in at the same time, and all of us play our mixes down back to back. And it was one of the most nerve-wracking things to go head-to-head against other mixers and then be judged by one of the best mixers. So that really pushed all of us, and not only that, we were able to kind of, wrap, we'd bounce ideas back and forth off each other, or if I had something that sounded incredible, they'd be like, "How did you do that?" and vice versa. So we'd be like, "Damn, that snare sounds incredible! Like, what did you do to that snare?" And then they'd tell us, and so it was like a competition. It was very friendly competition because, of course, we want to look and sound better than the guy we're up against, or the other guys. But we also had this sense of family where we were sharing what we did, and it was totally open. We weren't keeping anything for ourselves.
How long did you do the mix squad for?
That didn't last very long. Maybe 6 months to a year.
Mm-hmm. Why didn't it last longer?
I think it was just hard to manage. Dave was so busy, and we would get busy, so it was just hard to coordinate everyone's schedules. And and our careers were kind of pulling us in different directions, and so it was definitely a cool concept, and it really pushed us. But I think we all just got pulled in our own directions. You know what I mean? All
right, from mix squad, what was the next stage there?
The next stage was more mixing, but then I started tracking more.
But you were but while you were doing mix squad, you were also mixing on your own as well.
Still mixing on my own,
so that was kind of going together. Yeah,
doing both.
What year is this?
2006, 2007, I think, somewhere in there.
Right.
But it was still a fight to get mixes. You know what I mean? Because I had some success, and I had my records I had mixed get Grammy nominated, but unless you're, done over 51% of the album, you don't personally get nominated, or unless it's album of the year or whatever.
Sure.
So, anyways, I'd had some success, but still, hustling to get mixes and always engineering at the same time, mixing big and small stuff. Somehow through one session or another, I ended up connecting with a writer named Stacy Barthe, who at the time she was like writing for Britney Spears and Rihanna and stuff like that, and she was signed to Universal as a writer. And so because she loved my sound so much, and we were able to kind of bang out records so fast, she brought me over to Universal Music, and I became like a house engineer for them, working with all their writers and producers and coordinating writing sessions and doing all that stuff. And then at the same time, I kind of had, this little hustle where, and you guys can steal this if you want to. Basically, I would offer commission to studio managers. So I would say, hey, if you get me work, I'll give you a percentage of my rate.
Sure.
And a lot of times they wouldn't want it, but I would still give it to them anyways, or I'd surprise them with it. And so I think that got me kind of popular with the managers because they weren't used to that. Like, I don't know if I was the only person doing it.
You were the only person doing it.
Anyways, because I started managing myself.
Did you do my product placement for Perrier?
Yes, get it in.
I actually like Pellegrino better. Sorry.
I was kind of used to paying out, between 10 and 20% to a manager. So once I started managing myself, I was like, why not just give it to the managers that are giving me the gigs? So yeah, at a few big studios around here, I would do that. And after the gigs, I would come back with cash and envelope and insist that they take it. A lot of times they'd be like, what? Like, this is weird. I already get paid, I'm like, no, just take it. And that seemed to keep me pretty busy. You know, I was still getting calls like the day of or the day before, because that's just like the on-demand economy, you know, that we work in. And so,
yeah, I think that's something that is important to talk about. A lot of studios are getting that 10 o'clock at night booking to redo a vocal, to remix a track, whatever it might be, do an overdub, especially in the pop, R&B, hip hop world.
Right.
In that world, it can just be like features like, oh, blah, blah, blah is available now.
Right.
You want to hear a verse with so-and-so rapping, speaking, sing, whatever it is. He's available, she's available now.
Right. And you have to be ready to go.
Yeah, and they're calling all of the pop R&B, you know, the Paramounts and all that stuff and saying, NRG, whatever, can I get in tonight?
Yeah.
And one of them says yes, and then they call you.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're pretty far down the totem pole. I mean, you know, unless you're in with someone full time, and then that has its own challenges. But yeah, I was taking a lot of last minute sessions. And so one of those, like exactly like you're saying, P. Diddy, Puff, you know, whatever he's going by right now, he was working at Chalice. And I think his engineer got sick and like at the last second called out. So Chalice is calling up engineers that they kind of, you know, have on their list or they know of, and like, hey, are you available right now for a P. Diddy session? I think they called a few people that weren't available or just, you know, weren't willing to take a last minute booking. And I did it because it was going to be for like 4 days, and they're all starting like, you know, they were all-nighter sessions. But I went in and did it, and I did such a good enough job that I guess I made an impression on Diddy, which I didn't realize at the time. I just, you know, I went in, did my work, left. You know, the other guy ended up coming back once he was not sick, you know, and I didn't really hear anything from those guys. You know, I kept doing what I was doing, working for Universal, doing my own mixing for labels and independent artists, taking sessions wherever I could. And then I got a call from one of Diddy's like assistants or whoever it was, asking if I was available to do a Nicki Minaj session. And I'd never heard of this woman before, but I was like,
what year was this?
This would be probably maybe 2009. The years start blurring together, but 2009, 2010, I do the Diddy session, and then probably 6 months later, I get a call from his camp saying, you know, can you do the Nicki Minaj thing? And it was to be like a full-time engineer for her, and I'd never heard of her. So I started, you know, kind of calling around, because at this point I'd built up, you know, my network of contacts and friends. You know, the industry's tiny, and I started asking people, and I come to find out she had already like gone through 10 engineers that either couldn't cut it for whatever reason, whether it was her not liking them or them not being able to keep up with the workload, or, you know, her personality, whatever it was. I just remember thinking, hey, why not? This sounds like a pretty awesome gig. And so I go in thinking I'm just going to be tracking some hip hop vocals for our like first kind of session. And then she started singing. And for me, I was like super excited because I knew what I could do with a singer, because I'd gotten so good at melodyning and auto-tuning and what I call the vocal post-production, you know, as far as timing and vocal line and all that stuff. Because that was like the one area I felt like I could really outshine other people, is by putting extra work into the vocals, making the vocals sound incredible. And then if the beat sounded okay, then cool. But as long as the vocals were like beyond, you know, if I was doing production things that other people couldn't do or didn't have the wherewithal to do, I'd do it. And so with her, it was like the perfect opportunity. So I was super excited. And I even told her, I was like, oh my gosh, like the things we'll be able to do. And I don't know, again, I think it was the attitude, probably more than my skill set.
Right.
Combination. The combination. So, and we vibed and we hit it off. And I ended up tracking and then mixing her entire first album, which broke, you know, countless records for sales for a female hip hop artist. And I think the amount of songs we had Billboard Hot 100, a few records we broke. And the fact that I had recorded and mixed the entire thing, I think was kind of unique.
Who was the producer?
Every track had a different producer. Right. And they never even came to the studio. Nicki was so hands-on and
So just
controlling.
you and her working vocals? Just you and her doing the
Just
vocals?
me and her. And Safari as well, because he was her partner, I'd say her partner in crime at the time, kind of just there to help and assist with whatever she needed. I think his official like label or credit on the album was A&R coordinator, which he did do a lot of that. But it was just me, her, and Safari for the entire record. I think we had an A&R come in at the end just to hear it down. But it was really a unique thing because I had spent so much time mixing and I'd spent so much time tracking that I was really able to be confident in doing both. And I had the drive to do it because I think when you're tracking, a lot of times you just want to get it out of your hands. But I really, made it apparent, like I want to be the one to mix it. And I think even in the beginning, the A&R sent out the first song to be mixed by someone else. And I kind of told Nicki, I was like, I've spent so much time mixing this that if I'm going to send it to another mixer, I'm going to take my plugins off the vocals because why should he have my compression EQ settings and get the credit for what I've done? So we sent it to him to mix it, and she hated it, and she demanded that I mix the entire album. And I think we just had a certain chemistry, and we were both so controlling that it just worked out. And
you're opening up such a can of worms here for a potential discussion about this. Now I get, if it goes to external mixers, I get it used to be, not even that long ago, 10 years ago for me, it used to be, I don't want your plugins. I won't even have your plugins. I don't want your volume rides. I don't want your panning. Just send me a rough mix. That's all I need.
Right.
Give me everything like it's tape. That's what everybody used to ask for. Now, they're like, send me your session exactly as it is. So I can just go tweak, tweak, done.
And I'm guilty of that, for sure.
Yeah.
Because if I have the option, I'll say, send me your world. Because at the end of the day, there's going to be certain things that people are married to that you won't be able to recreate.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you've got some kind of weird synthy kind of whatever, virtual instrument-y, panning around, digital delay, effecty, blah, whatever, totally. I get it because it's going to take you a week to figure out how to create something like that.
Right.
But I do think it's amusing when people pretty much want the same EQ and compressions on all the instruments. This is a good sideline point, and I wonder if you agree with it. I learned most of what I do from working with substandard, not very good bands, not very good artists, having to get great performances out of them, coaxing performances, having to rewrite the songs, having to play the instruments, having to tune them, have to comp them. I learned far more from that than I do from recording Aerosmith.
Yes, because when you're dealing with incredible musicians and musicianship, I think our job is kind of to get out of the way, capture it almost as raw as possible.
Maybe inspire at times.
Right. But then, like for me, the way I was learning was recording my band, which needed a lot of help.
Yeah.
Everything needed to be edited and comped, and it still wasn't sounding like, incredible. And so we're using every trick in the book, and that's where, a lot of experimentation. You start learning about phase correlation and all that stuff. If it's lower budget, you're going to have to use more creative techniques to get where you need to go.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, you get to work with these great guys and girls, and you're like, wait, this is a lot easier.
Yeah. Yeah, just kind of stay out of the way, let them do what they do, because you can't improve on, and maybe
it's a skill in itself.
Right.
Not screwing it up is a big skill.
Right. And that's again kind of knowing your place, like we talked about earlier. If you're the assistant, you're kind of working for the engineer, who's working for the producer, who's working for the label, and you kind of got to know where you fit in there. And I think it's the same with this too. If you kind of have to know when you're working with someone whose artistry is better than your own, and maybe that's a weird way of putting it, but
no, but I understand
that you don't subject yourself into the process just to like put yourself in it. You want to take when I'm floored by an incredible performance or artist or musician, I try to do as little as possible to reinvent it. Yeah. I just try to kind of stand and follow in their wake, so to speak.
Yeah. So with Nicki, you had some great success. How long were you with her for?
I was with her for 3 3 or 4 years. I did 4 albums with her. Basically, every album that she's done, I worked on and mixed a majority of it. The very last album, the Pink Print, I worked on less because I kind of started phasing myself out. And eventually Juice took over for me, who's managed also by my manager that I have now. But it got to the point where I was doing everything, you know, because I was so hungry in the beginning, I really wanted to be involved in everything. And so I was doing the live shows, I was doing, you know, if there was a taping for anything, I was involved with that. I was like her sound supervisor, and so I had to be available 24/7 and just to try and start a family and keep up with that. It was just too much. So I kind of started phasing myself out because she really does work like a maniac, like 24/7. I don't think she's ever turned off. Like she's always, I mean, if someone calls in with a big enough feature at whatever time, she'll go in and bust it out.
Now you're on your own and you're doing everything, multitasking.
Multitasking, yeah. A lot of mixing. I mean, I always kind of had this dream of being able to like mix at my own pace, and you know, I always use this term like mixing my boxers. You know, it's probably everyone's dream. So you know, after having the success with Nicki, I was able to get on a few big records. The Rihanna record and a few Drake records and Lil Wayne and a bunch of big records. And the Rihanna record got me my real Grammy nomination. And I think that combined with the success that I had with Nicki, just, I guess it finally got me enough work where I could start kind of working on my own schedule, start doing unattended sessions because people started finding my name and actually sending me sessions from around the country and even around the world. I started getting mixes from the UK, but I want to say a lot of them have come from South Korea, Australia, Germany, Russia.
Anybody who gets to the end, check out the course we did with Ariel.
Yes.
A lot of the mixing stuff that we're talking about, the mix bus, they'll see that.
Yep.
Some fun tricks on the vocals.
Yeah, a lot of, I try to put everything into that mix that, you know, are things that I kind of use or go through on every mix, you know what I mean? And I'm not sure if you'll be able to copy and paste the settings, but the technique and the approach behind it, I think that's what really gets captured, and that's what you'll see and be able to use in your own mixes right away. And I know there's something in there for everybody that will instantly take your mix into the next level. Something you haven't maybe thought about or tried, and also just techniques that I use with big artists on big songs. So there are things that you can apply to your own mixes. So
fantastic.
Yeah, I'm excited to share with everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a marvelous time recording mixing. Please leave a bunch of questions and comments below, and we'll speak to you all again very soon.